phone's dropped out on us.
It's not dropped, it's gone.
This is crazy. You ever seen this before? Hello?
Yeah, just not quite so sudden.
Combining the ancient Greek mythological figure of Sisyphus with the twisty, mind-bending narratives of movies like Christopher Nolan's Memento, Christopher Smith's cult 2009 horror film Triangle brings to this already compelling blend the long, rich tradition of nautical horror. From the doomed ship, the Demeter in Bram Stoker's Dracula, to the cursed ocean voyages that permeate the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft, literature alone has given us many haunting classic tales about supernatural terrors at sea. But the ghost ship phenomenon, a floating sea vessel with no crew, is one that long predates even these famous stories. The famous Canadian story of the bewitched canoe can be traced back to French colonisation of the country, where newly arrived European settlers told the First Nations people they met a story adapted from an old French legend. They updated and readapted this tale to the new colonial context and told the story of a group of lumberjacks who had made a pact with the devil to travel across a vast distance in a magical canoe to see their loved ones. The legendary tale of the Flying Dutchman, a cursed ship that must sail the oceans for all eternity and never make port, finds its origins in the Dutch Golden Age and spans back to at least the 18th century. Throughout history, a number of people have claimed to have seen this spectral ghost ship, including a young King George V, who reported seeing it just off the coastline of Australia in 1881. Although today such sightings are commonly believed to be less a real-life ghost ship and more to do with an optical illusion called a Fata Morgana, the Flying Dutchman has inspired everything from episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants to The Twilight Zone, and even a Tori Amos song of the same name. And while the now firmly debunked Bermuda Triangle urban legend was less to do with haunted boats as it was with a particularly cursed region of the ocean stretching between Florida, Bermuda and Puerto Rico, for those of us of a certain generation at least, we grew up believing that this curse was real and that any ships or planes that entered this particular space were doomed to disappear. But when it comes to ghost ships specifically, the essential point of reference for any history of this phenomenon surely can't go past the Mary Celeste. Built in Nova Scotia in Canada in 1861, her first few years at sea under the control of her American owners was fairly unremarkable. But on the 4th of December 1872, she was found in the ocean near Portugal adrift and with no one on board and her lifeboat missing. The logbook of the Mary Celeste had not been touched for 10 days, its cargo had not been opened, and the luggage and other personal belongings of its now disappeared crew all remained in place. While theories have since abounded, foul play, a killer squid, or some kind of other natural disaster are all common theories, to this very day the question of what happened to the 10 people on board the Mary Celeste still remains unsolved. This story of the Mary Celeste captured the public imagination, with even Sherlock Holmes' creator Arthur Conan Doyle penning a short story about the case in 1884 called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. Unsurprisingly perhaps, the story captured the imagination of filmmakers. In 1935, American filmmaker Denison Cliff directed one of the very first films for the legendary UK horror studio Hammer. The Mystery of the Mary Celeste with Bela Lugosi was released in the United States also as Phantom Ship. Then, only a few years later in 1943, Mark Robson would make the film The Ghost Ship for RKO in collaboration with legendary producer Val Lewton. Lewton's horror films of this decade, such as Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie, would of course become some of the most celebrated and critically championed horror releases of this period. The subject of a heated plagiarism case, the ghost ship somewhat poetically effectively disappeared until it entered the public domain in the 1990s, further adding to the critical consensus that Lewton's horror productions of the 1940s were, in their own way, just as important and as significant as the earlier Universal monster movies the decade before, albeit not as widely known. Looking back at film history more generally, we find time and time again how the ocean has proven to be an enduring inspiration. At their most simple, even without taking the ghost ship tradition into account, just in terms of their narrative efficiency, ships or boats have long offered filmmakers of horror movies and thrillers an effectively isolated and spectacular location within which to set taut genre films, that pivot around their characters' feelings of isolation and distance from the mainland. We find this in boat-set chamber pieces like Roman Polanski's Knife on the Water, Philip Noyce's Dead Calm with Nicole Kidman and Sam Neill, and even Richard Franklin's final film Visitors, starring Ryder Mitchell and written by iconic Australian genre screenwriter Everett de Roche. Taking a more comic approach to the isolation afforded by the yacht setting, Rob Grant's 2019 horror comedy Harpoon is similarly set on a small boat, telling the story of three friends in a love triangle who are trapped on a boat and are pushed to their limits after the truth of an infidelity surfaces. But even going back further, we find a precursor to these more psychological thriller-toned horror movies in, of course, the climactic boat sequence in the classic 1962 J. Lee Thompson film noir and proto-serial killer film Cape Fear. Here, Robert Mitchum's crazed killer Max Cady really sets the bar for similar boat-based psychos in years to come, including, of course, Robert De Niro's rendition of the very same character in Martin Scorsese's powerful 1991 remake of the same name. Shipwrecks too have formed the basis of a number of iconic horror films that add further richness and diversity to the notion of oceanic horror. French surrealist horror filmmaker Jean Rollin loved the sea, and across his lush oeuvre we find he constantly returned to the beach at his beloved Dieppe in France in particular. This location can be seen in some of his most beloved films such as The Rape of the Vampire from 1968, The Nude Vampire from 1970, The Iron Rose in 1973, and Lips of Blood from 1975. But it is surely in his 1974 film The Demoniacs, also known as Curse of the Living Dead, that Rollin's poetic engagement with the sea and shipwrecks in particular is surely the most evocative. The Demoniacs tells the story of a group of shipwreckers who deliberately crash into other ships so they can plunder their loot. Here, the film's core narrative is prompted when these shipwreckers rape and murder two young women they find during one of their brutal raids, unaware that the victims, twin sisters, will return as spirits in an attempt to enact bloody revenge. In 1980, John Carpenter of course positioned a shipwreck at the heart of his very different movie, the horror classic The Fog. Here, the residents of the small town of Antonio Bay on the California coast must face the horrors of their past as they contend with the ghosts of angry, revenge-seeking lepers who were killed at sea 100 years before. Elsewhere, in movies like the 1978 made-for-TV horror movie Cruise into Terror, we find a cruise ship provides a suitably glamorous backdrop for what is otherwise a fairly standard colour-by-numbers horror story. In this case, a cursed Egyptian sarcophagus that is brought on board unleashes hell when those on board discover it contains none other than Satan's own son. And while perhaps not technically a horror movie per se, while lacking the supernatural elements of something like Cruise into Terror, the 1978 screen adaptation of Agatha Christie's Death on the Nile saw Sir Peter Ustinov's Hercule Poirot investigating a stream of body count-style murders that were effectively very similar to that decade's slasher movie formula. A twee slasher film set on a boat, Death on the Nile in particular is perhaps a notable precursor to everything from Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, and the Australian trash favourite Houseboat Horror. Across all these kinds of different horror movies and others, we find time and time again that the sea holds a potential array of dark horrors. Barbara Peter's 1980 film Humanoids from the Deep is a science fiction monster movie classic, where terrifying underwater monsters pull unsuspecting victims to their deaths, killing the men and raping the women. While a notably rare woman-directed horror film from this era, it is perhaps worth noting that Peters herself did not direct the sometimes graphic scenes of sexual violence in the film. These were, allegedly, added later by producer Roger Corman without her involvement. In contrast, Nissa Hardiman's Sea Fever is a very different woman-directed oceanic horror film, a Lovecraftian tale set off the Irish coast. Sea Fever follows a young PhD student forced to undertake research on a small fishing trawler with a group of financially struggling fishers when they all discover that the algae coating the underside of the boat is much more dangerous than they first believed. From Jaws to Wreck 4 Apocalypse, Virus to Deep Rising, Blood Vessel to The Last Voyage of the Demeter, ships and boats have become such a pervasive motif in contemporary horror as to almost effectively have become a subgenre in its own right. But in regards to Triangle specifically, two films are notable and important precursors, both which share similar names and even similar poster art. In both Alvin Rakoff's Death Ship from 1980 and Steve Beck's Ghost Ship from 2002, Like Triangle, the films follow a group of people seemingly forced by an accident to board a ship they will soon discover is haunted or otherwise cursed. In Death Ship, a cruise ship full of travellers collides with an ominous black freighter, leaving its desperate survivors no choice but to board the boat they do not realise has caused their accident in the first place. As the tourists are killed one by one, the survivors discover strange relics on board from 1930s Germany, leading to the revelation that this film's ghost ship in question is in fact a one-time Nazi floating prison, the spirits of its now dead passengers wreaking havoc on the lives of its newfound victims. More recently, like Triangle, Ghost Ship 2 was filmed in part at least in Queensland, Australia, which is not the only thing that these films share. Like Death Ship before it, Ghost Ship follows a group of marine salvagers in the Bering Sea who see their fortunes in the newly discovered missing Italian cruise ship, the MS Antonio Grazia, which disappeared in 1962. When their own boat explodes, however, they have no choice but to attempt to repair the ghost ship in order to safely return to shore. One by one, the doomed crew here too are killed by the spectres who haunt the ship, as the true horrors of this particular cursed ocean liner become apparent. While Triangle at first appears to be trading in the same kind of haunted cruise ship dynamics as both Ghost Ship and Death Ship, as we realise as this strange tale unfolds, there is much more at stake here than at first appears. Held together by a career best performance by Melissa George, who should be celebrated much more widely as a true scream queen based on this movie alone, Triangle reminds us why ghost ships and ocean horror are so enduring. It pushes the limits of what can be done in this subgeneric context, reminding us that with a little bit of imagination and the right cast and crew, the ocean's nightmare potential is effectively limitless.